You know what finally pushed me over the edge? I built a set of raised garden beds for my wife about 4 years ago. Used pressure-treated pine from the big box store, the same stuff everybody uses. Screwed it all together on a Saturday, sealed the end grain, did everything right. 2 years later, the bottom rails were soft enough to push my thumb into. 4 years in, I was ripping the whole thing out and starting over. And that really got under my skin because right around the same time, I was reading about a Viking ship they pulled out of a burial mound in Norway. The Oseberg ship. Built around 830, buried in clay for over 1,000 years. And when they excavated it, the oak planking was still structurally sound. 1,000 years in the ground versus 4 years in my backyard. That contrast sent me down a path I did not expect, and what I found completely changed how I think about wood. Today, I am going to walk you through 5 methods the Norse shipwrights and timber builders used that made their wood last centuries, while ours barely survives a decade. And stick around to the end, because I will show you a simple trick you can use at the lumber yard to start picking dramatically better boards right now. Let me show you what I learned. The Norse relationship with timber is one of the oldest and most proven wood traditions in the world, and what makes it so valuable to us today is that these were not theoretical ideas. The proof is still standing. Once you understand the thinking behind how they selected and prepared their wood, you start to see modern lumber in a completely different light. So let me give you some context. The Scandinavian peninsula during the Viking Age, roughly the late 700s through the 1000s, was one of the most timber-dependent cultures in human history. They built everything from wood: ships, homes, storage buildings, temples, and eventually the stave churches, some of which are still standing today. After nearly 900 years, the Borgund stave church in western Norway was built around 1180, and it is still there, not reconstructed, not preserved under glass, still standing in the weather, in a climate that gets brutal winters and wet summers. And when researchers have studied the timber in these structures, they keep finding the same things: incredibly tight growth rings, high resin content, grain that is perfectly continuous from one end of the board to the other. None of that is an accident. The Norse did not just grab whatever tree was closest and start building. They had a system for selecting, harvesting, and preparing timber that was refined over generations. And at the core of that system was a simple idea that modern forestry has almost completely abandoned. The idea that how and when you harvest a tree matters just as much as what you do with it afterward. That principle guided everything they did, and it starts with the very first method I want to show you. The first method is winter felling, and this might be the single biggest difference between how the Norse harvested timber and how we do it today. In modern commercial logging, trees come down year-round based on market demand and equipment availability. The season does not really factor in, but the Norse felled their timber almost exclusively in the dead of winter, typically from late December through February, during the coldest and darkest months of the Scandinavian year. And there is a very specific reason for that. During winter, a tree is dormant. Its metabolism has essentially shut down. The sap has retreated from the outer layers, and the moisture content in the wood drops to its lowest natural point of the year. In a living pine tree during summer, moisture content in the sapwood can run as high as 150%. In winter dormancy, that can drop below 80%. That is a massive difference, and it matters for 2 reasons. First, lower moisture means the wood begins its drying process from a much better starting point. Less water to remove means less cellular stress, less checking, and less warping. Second, and this is the part most people miss, the tree's extractives, its natural resins, tannins, and antifungal compounds are concentrated in the heartwood and inner sapwood during dormancy. They are not diluted by active sap flow, so a winter-felled log starts its life as lumber with a higher concentration of the very chemicals that prevent rot. When I first learned this, I thought about every piece of lumber I have ever bought. Not once has anyone at a lumber yard been able to tell me what season that tree came down. Not once. And according to this tradition, that single detail might be the most important factor in how long that board is going to last. The second method is how the Norse selected their trees in the first place, and this is where the science gets really compelling. They did not want fast-growing trees from fertile, lowland soil. They specifically sought out pine that had grown slowly in harsh conditions, thin rocky soil, high elevation, cold exposure, short growing seasons. The kind of tree that might put on only 1/32 of an inch of new growth per year. And the reason comes down to basic wood anatomy. Every growth ring in a tree represents 1 year of life. A wide ring means the tree grew fast that year with lots of soft, porous early wood. A narrow ring means it grew slowly, and the proportion of dense, thick-walled late wood is much higher relative to the overall ring width. In practical terms, a fast-grown plantation pine might show 3 to 5 rings per inch. The slow-growth Scandinavian pine the Norse favored could show 25 to 40 rings per inch. That is not a subtle difference. That is a completely different material. The dense wood is harder, more resistant to moisture penetration, and far less hospitable to the fungi that cause rot. But there is another factor that makes slow-growth northern pine almost uniquely durable. A compound called pinosylvin. It is a natural antifungal chemical that pine produces in its heartwood, and trees that grow under stress in harsh environments produce significantly more of it. Pinosylvin is toxic to brown rot and white rot fungi, the two primary organisms that destroy structural wood. The Norse did not know the chemistry, but they absolutely knew the result. They could see that timber from a stunted, wind-beaten pine on a rocky hillside outlasted timber from a tall, straight tree in a river valley every single time. And they built their selection process around that observation. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The third method is how the Norse broke down their logs, and this is something that took me a while to fully appreciate. They did not saw their timber, they rived it. Riving means splitting the log along its natural grain using wedges, axes, and sometimes a tool called a froe. The split follows the wood fibers exactly, running parallel to the grain from one end to the other. When you saw a board, especially on a modern bandsaw or circular mill, the blade cuts across fibers wherever the log's natural geometry dictates. Even a perfectly straight log produces sawn boards where the grain runs out the face or edge in places. Those exposed, severed fibers become entry points for moisture. Water wicks into cut grain the way it wicks into the end of a paper towel. A riven board, by contrast, has completely intact grain from end to end. Every fiber runs continuously through the full length of the piece. Moisture has no broken pathways to follow into the interior of the wood. The surface is naturally more water-resistant even before any finish is applied. I tried riving a piece of red oak a couple of years ago after learning about this, just to see the difference. The surface that came off the split was noticeably different from a sawn face. It had an almost waxy feel to it, and when I dripped water on both surfaces side by side, the water beaded on the riven face and soaked into the sawn face within seconds. Same board, same species, completely different behavior. For the Norse, this was not optional. This was how you made wood that would survive the North Atlantic. The fourth method is patience, specifically how the Norse dried their timber. They air dried it, slowly, in covered stacks with spacers between every board, exposed to natural airflow, but protected from direct rain and sun. And they did this for years, not weeks. Modern kiln drying can take a batch of pine from green to 6 to 8% moisture content in a matter of days. It is efficient and it is fast, and it feeds a supply chain that demands quick turnaround. But speed comes at a cost. When you force moisture out of wood cells rapidly at high temperature, the cell walls can collapse, check, and harden in a stressed state. The wood reaches its target moisture number, but its internal structure has been damaged in ways that are not always visible on the surface. Air drying allows moisture to migrate out of the wood gradually. The cell walls relax and stabilize naturally. The resin, rather than being volatilized and driven off by kiln heat, remains in the wood, where it continues to serve as a natural preservative. Researchers studying timber from the Gokstad ship built around 890, found that the resin in the oak and pine planking was still present and still chemically active after more than 1,000 years. Kiln drying at modern temperatures would have driven a significant portion of those compounds out of the wood before it ever reached a builder's hands. The Norse approach to drying was not about convenience. It was about giving the wood time to become what it was going to be. The fifth method ties everything together, and it is about which part of the tree they actually used. The Norse strongly favored heartwood, the dense, dark inner core of the trunk. They understood, through generations of observation, that heartwood outlasts sapwood dramatically. And modern wood science confirms exactly why. Heartwood is dead tissue. The tree has already filled those cells with extractives, resins, tannins, and phenolic compounds. It is the tree's own long-term storage vault of protective chemistry. Sapwood, the lighter outer ring of the trunk, is living tissue full of starches and sugars that fungi love to eat. A piece of pine sapwood left on the ground in a temperate climate will show visible fungal colonization within months. The heartwood from the same tree can resist that same exposure for years or even decades, depending on species and resin content. The Norse took this further by reading the tree's history in its cross-section. They looked for signs of stress, tight rings that indicated harsh growing years, resin pockets that showed the tree had fought off damage, and an overall profile that told them this tree had spent its life building density rather than height. When you combine heartwood selection with slow growth, winter felling, riving, and patient air drying, you end up with a piece of timber that is almost engineered by nature to last. And the Norse knew how to read every one of those signals. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself, that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is buying lumber based on appearance and price. Most of us walk into a lumber yard, look for straight boards with minimal knots, check the price, and load up the truck. We almost never flip the board over and count the growth rings on the end grain. But ring density is one of the single most reliable indicators of how that board will perform over time, especially outdoors. The second pattern is trusting the kiln-dried stamp as a mark of quality. We assume that if lumber has been kiln-dried, it is ready to go and it is good material. But kiln drying tells you almost nothing about the cellular integrity of the wood or whether its natural preservative compounds survived the process. It just tells you the moisture number hit a target. The third pattern is using sapwood without a second thought. Most dimensional lumber from big box stores is a mix of heartwood and sapwood, and many boards are predominantly sapwood. We treat it all the same, but the durability difference between the two is enormous. The Norse would have rejected a sapwood-heavy board outright for any structural or exterior application. The fourth pattern is assuming that a chemical treatment can replace what nature already put in the wood. Pressure-treated lumber is saturated with preservatives precisely because the base material, usually fast-grown southern yellow pine with wide growth rings and plenty of sapwood, has almost no natural resistance to decay. We are essentially trying to add back artificially what was bred out of the wood through decades of plantation forestry, focused on speed over quality. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start making better choices one board at a time. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning, this is something I started doing after studying how the Norse evaluated their timber, and it takes about 5 seconds at the lumber yard. Before you put any board in your cart, look at the end grain. Count the growth rings across 1 inch of width. You can use your thumbnail width as a rough 1-inch reference, or carry a small ruler in your pocket. If you count fewer than 8 rings per inch, that is fast growth wood, it will be lighter, softer, more porous, and more vulnerable to moisture and rot. If you count 12 or more rings per inch, you are looking at significantly denser material with better natural durability. 20+ rings per inch, and you have something genuinely exceptional. I started sorting my lumber this way 2 years ago, and the difference in my outdoor projects has been noticeable. The boards are harder, they hold fasteners better, they move less with seasonal changes, and they are holding up dramatically better in the weather. It costs nothing. It takes seconds, and it is the closest thing we have to the Norse method of tree selection available to us in a modern lumber yard. Now, If this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. That is what I learned from studying how the Norse built things that lasted centuries. Winter felling, slow growth selection, riving along the grain, patient air drying, and heartwood preference. 5 methods, none of them complicated, all of them grounded in observation and common sense. We might not be able to replicate every detail in a modern shop, but we can absolutely start applying the principles. Pick better wood, be patient with how you dry it, respect the grain, and let the tree do some of the work for you. Thanks for sticking with me on this one, and I will see you in the next video.